Between 1882 and 1896, the Smithsonian Institution excavated more than 3,000 burial mounds across Ohio and the surrounding Midwest. They employed hundreds of workers. They filled warehouses with artifacts. They took thousands of photographs. They spent 14 years and significant public resources on the largest systematic archaeological project in American history to that point. And in 1894, they published a 1,200-page final report that covered a fraction of what they had actually found, and came to a conclusion so tidy and so final that it effectively closed the question before anyone had a chance to examine what was being closed. The mounds were built by the ancestors of modern Native American tribes. Nothing mysterious, no lost civilization, no advanced technology, primitive earthworks built by primitive people. Case closed. Except the math does not work. 3,000 mounds excavated, thousands of artifacts recovered, less than 2% of the collected data published. The other 98% archived in basement storage facilities, where independent researchers cannot access it, where Freedom of Information Act requests are denied on grounds of fragility and ongoing study, where the specific skeletal remains that multiple field agents described in their private correspondence as unusually large have been officially reclassified as either misidentified, lost, or destroyed. You funded this excavation. It was conducted by a public institution on public land with public money. The data belongs to you, and the institution that collected it has spent 130 years explaining why you cannot see it. The question that explanation is designed to prevent you from asking is the only question worth asking. What did they find in those mounds that had to be buried a second time? The state of Ohio in the early 19th century was covered with earthen mounds. Thousands of them distributed across the landscape in a density and with a geometric consistency that the settlers who first encountered them could not account for within any framework their education had given them. Some were small, a few feet high, the kind of feature that could be attributed to natural accumulation or simple burial practice. Others were massive. Structures rising 60 feet or more containing multiple distinct burial chambers arranged in sequences that indicated planning across generations. The largest mound complexes covered hundreds of acres. They were not random. They were geometric in a way that required surveying capability and mathematical knowledge that the official historical model of North American prehistory in the period attributed to the builders does not accommodate. Circles, octagons. Animal effigies stretching across hillsides, serpents and bears and birds rendered in earth at scales only visible from elevation. Some of the geometric enclosures at Newark in central Ohio cover 4 square miles of precisely engineered earthwork. The octagon there aligns with the lunar standstill cycle, the 18.5-year cycle of the moon's maximum and minimum rising and setting points on the horizon. Encoding that alignment in a physical structure requires tracking the lunar cycle across multiple generations and retaining the astronomical knowledge in a form transmissible enough to direct the geometry of construction. The local settlers knew about the mounds from the moment they arrived. They had been digging into them since the 1700s looking for anything valuable, and they found things. Copper breastplates weighing over 20 pounds, hammered into shape with precision and decorated with intricate designs. Mica sheets over 4 feet across, cut into perfect geometric forms with edges straight and smooth in ways that no crude stone tool can produce. Stone tablets engraved with symbols that do not match any known Native American pictographic tradition. These were not the artifacts of a simple burial culture. They were the artifacts of something that understood materials, geometry, and long-distance logistics at a level the official story of pre-contact North America has never satisfactorily explained. The metallurgy is where the official explanation first starts to strain. In mound after mound across Ohio, excavators found copper, not raw copper hammered cold into crude shapes, refined copper. Copper that had been worked with a level of skill and intentionality that produces objects indistinguishable in their finished quality from the work of trained metalworkers in any tradition. The copper breastplates found in Ohio mounds weighed over 20 pounds each. They were hammered to uniform thickness across large surface areas and decorated with geometric and representational designs executed with a consistency that requires controlled working technique. The copper itself did not come from Ohio. It came from the Great Lakes region, 500 miles away. That distance is not a geological footnote. It represents a supply chain, a system for identifying, extracting, transporting, and distributing raw material across half a continent that implies organizational infrastructure at a scale the standard model of Hopewell and Adena culture has always struggled to fully account for. The mica tells the same story from a different angle. Mica is a mineral that cleaves into thin, transparent sheets. It is fragile. It requires careful and precise working to cut without shattering. The mica sheets found in Ohio mounds were over 4 feet in diameter, cut into perfect circles and squares and crescents with edges that are straight and smooth. The mica did not come from Ohio either. It came from the Appalachian Mountains 300 miles to the east. two different raw materials, two different distant sources. Both appearing in the same burial complexes, both work to a standard of finish that requires either tools we have not identified at these sites or techniques we have not reconstructed. The engraved stone tablets found in some of the mounds extend the problem further. The symbols on them are organized, structured. They do not resemble the pictographic traditions of any Native American culture documented at contact. Researchers comparing them to known scripts have noted similarities to Nordic runes, to symbols found in Mediterranean contexts, to writing systems from the ancient Near East. The Smithsonian's official position is that these tablets are either forgeries or misinterpreted natural markings, but they were found in sealed burial chambers, surrounded by artifacts that no one disputes the authenticity of. If they are forgeries, someone went to extraordinary trouble to place them where only a systematic excavation would find them. The artifacts are the part of the Ohio Mound story that can be argued about in terms of interpretation and cultural attribution. The skeletal remains are the part that the institutional record has handled in a way that places argument itself beyond reach. Multiple newspaper accounts from the late 19th century describe the discovery of unusually large skeletal remains in Ohio mounds. The Wheeling Daily Intelligencer reported in 1870 that a mound contained a skeleton measuring 7 feet 6 inches. The New York Times reported in 1894 that mounds in Ohio contained skeletons reaching heights of 8 feet. Local papers across Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin published similar accounts throughout the 1880s and 1890s, naming specific sites, specific measurements, specific witnesses. These were not tabloid publications covering sensational fiction. They were the same newspapers that covered elections and commerce and the daily business of their communities. Their reporters applied the same documentary standards to archaeological finds that they applied to everything else. Skeptics note that individual accounts can be exaggerated, that untrained observers misjudge dimensions, that the newspaper culture of the era was more tolerant of sensational reporting than modern journalism. These are reasonable objections applied to a single account in isolation. They are less persuasive applied to dozens of independent accounts from different states, different decades, different reporters describing the same specific dimensional range with the same specific features. What makes the pattern impossible to resolve is the institutional response. The Smithsonian's own field reports, the internal documents written by the agents who were actually present at the excavations, mention unusually large skeletal remains in language that is matter of fact rather than sensational. Those mentions did not appear in the published final report. Researchers who have subsequently requested access to the skeletal collections, specifically seeking remains in the height range described in the contemporary accounts, have been denied. The Smithsonian's response to these requests follows a consistent pattern. The materials are too fragile for public access. The remains are being studied by approved researchers. No skeletal material matching the described dimensions exists in the accessible collection. That last statement directly contradicts the field reports written by the Smithsonian's own agents in the field. Either those field agents were systematically wrong about what they were measuring, or the material they described was separated from the accessible collection at some point between its arrival and the present day. Cyrus Thomas was not a fringe figure. He was a respected scientist, a trained archaeologist brought in by the Smithsonian to lead the division of mound exploration, precisely because his professional credibility would lend authority to whatever conclusions the project produced. The mission, as stated, was to answer the mound builder question definitively, to excavate systematically, document everything, catalogue every artifact, and produce a scientific record that would settle the debate about who built these structures and what they represented. The project ran for 14 years. Over 3,000 mounds opened, hundreds of workers employed across multiple field seasons, warehouses of artifacts collected, thousands of photographs taken. And in 1894, the final report was published, 1,200 pages, a document of substantial scope that nonetheless covered only a small fraction of the excavations actually conducted and addressed only a portion of the artifacts actually collected. Less than 2% of the collected data appeared in the published record. The remaining 98% was archived, not temporarily archived pending future publication. Archived in a way that has remained effectively inaccessible to independent researchers for 130 years, despite the Smithsonian being a public institution, funded by taxpayer resources, whose collected materials are in a meaningful sense public property. The Freedom of Information Act requests filed by researchers seeking access to the unpublished mound data have been denied. The stated reasons vary. The materials are deteriorating. Access requires specialized conditions. Study is ongoing by approved researchers. Digital scanning could address the deterioration concern without requiring physical access to fragile originals. Photographs could be released without any risk to physical specimens. neither has happened. Richard Dewhurst in 2005 filed specific requests seeking access to skeletal remains over 7 feet in height, documented in the Smithsonian's own field reports. The response was that no such remains exist in the collection. The field reports documenting their collection still exist. The remains documented in those reports do not appear to. The official story of what happened to the mound builders is assimilation. The cultures that built the Ohio earthworks gradually merged with later populations, their specific practices and traditions diffusing into the broader fabric of pre-contact North American cultural development. This explanation has a problem that the standard academic framework around it has never fully addressed. The Native American tribes documented at European contact in Ohio and the surrounding region did not claim the mounds as the work of their ancestors. Multiple tribes told early European settlers that the mounds were already ancient when their people arrived in the region, that the structures had been built by a different people who were gone before living memory in a way that was not gradual assimilation, but something more like disappearance. The Hopewell and Adena cultures that archaeologists associate with the mound-building tradition show a discontinuity with the cultures documented at contact that the assimilation model does not fully explain. The specific knowledge required to build the Newark earthworks or the Great Serpent Mound, the astronomical literacy, the surveying capability, the organizational infrastructure for managing large-scale labor across multiple generations, does not appear in the material culture of the contact-era tribes in the same region. Knowledge of this kind, when it persists through assimilation, leaves traces. It leaves continuity of technique, continuity of design language, continuity of the specific practices that produce the artifacts. The discontinuity in the Ohio record is not the gradual fading of a tradition. It looks more like an ending. What ended it, and when and under what circumstances, are questions the published record from the 3,000 mound excavation does not answer, perhaps because the unpublished 98% does. Understanding why the Smithsonian might handle this material the way it has handled it does not require assuming malice. It requires understanding the institutional context in which the Division of Mound Exploration was operating. The Bureau of Ethnology under John Wesley Powell was not conducting neutral academic research in isolation from the political events surrounding it. It was operating in the middle of the active period of Native American dispossession. The legal and policy frameworks being used to justify the seizure of indigenous lands rested on specific claims about the nature and sophistication of pre-contact North American civilization. Insistence that North American prehistory showed a linear development from simple to complex, with no evidence of advanced civilization prior to European contact, served a specific function in that context. It supported the idea that the continent had not been home to anything that could be called a civilization in the European sense, which made the displacement of its inhabitants easier to frame as the natural advance of a more sophisticated social order into a less developed territory. Evidence of a sophisticated pre-contact civilization with trade networks spanning half a continent, astronomical knowledge encoded in large-scale architecture, metallurgical capability producing objects of high finish quality, and potentially skeletal evidence of a physically different prior population, complicated that framework in ways the institutional apparatus managing the dispossession had no interest in accommodating. Powell was not a cartoon villain. He was a man with a theoretical commitment, a set of institutional relationships, and the authority to manage what his organization collected and what it published. Managing the publication of the mound excavation data in a way that supported his existing theoretical framework rather than challenged it was not a dramatic conspiracy. It was what institutional leaders do when the evidence threatens the framework on which their authority depends. The artifacts that were published represent less than 2% of what was collected. The skeletal remains that multiple field agents described in their private correspondence as unusually large are officially either lost, destroyed, or never existed despite the field reports that document their collection. The stone tablets with organized symbol systems resembling ancient scripts from multiple traditions are officially either forgeries or misidentified natural markings despite being found in sealed contexts with uncontested authentic artifacts. Independent researchers seeking access to the unpublished data have been denied for 130 years. The stated reasons for denial have changed over time, but the denial has not. This pattern does not require a secret society or a coordinated conspiracy to produce. It requires only an institution that collected evidence threatening to a framework it was committed to maintaining, that made decisions about what to publish and what to archive, and that continued making those decisions across successive administrations because the institutional commitment to the framework outlasted any individual who made the original choices. The questions the pattern raises are not conspiracy theories. They are questions about scientific transparency and institutional accountability that apply to any public institution handling public data. Where are the unpublished field reports from the 3,000 mound excavations? Where are the artifacts that filled the warehouses the project generated? Where are the skeletal remains documented in the field agent's own correspondence? What do the stone tablets with the organized symbol systems actually say when examined by linguists without a prior commitment to the conclusion that they are meaningless? These are not unreasonable questions. They are the questions any serious examination of the published record produces, and they have been waiting for answers for 130 years. The mounds that survived development are still there. The Great Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio. The Newark Earthworks in Licking County. The Hopewell Mound Group in Ross County. These structures have been protected by various preservation efforts across the past century, and their physical presence continues to raise the questions the published record was designed to close. The astronomical alignments are measurable. The geometric precision is documentable. The engineering knowledge required to produce these structures at this scale with this accuracy is not something the official model of the cultures credited with building them has ever satisfactorily accounted for. The newspaper archives from the 1870s through the 1890s are still in libraries across Ohio. The accounts of skeletal dimensions and artifact descriptions, written by reporters who were present at excavations, are still on those pages. They were not recalled and revised when the Smithsonian published its final report. They sit in the record as they were written, by named journalists in legitimate publications, describing things they observed directly in specific places on specific dates. The Smithsonian's own field reports, the internal documents written by the agents who conducted the actual excavations, are partially accessible through archival research. Gap between what those reports describe and what the published record contains is not ambiguous. It is a documented discrepancy between what was found and what was reported, produced by a public institution using public resources, and sustained for 130 years through a combination of restricted access, denied requests, and official positions that contradict the institution's own internal documentation. 3,000 mounds excavated, less than 2% published. 98% archived where independent researchers cannot verify what it contains or confirm that it still exists. The evidence that was buried the first time stayed buried for 1,000 years. The evidence buried the second time has been in the Smithsonian's basement for 130. The mounds in Ohio are still in the landscape. The questions they raise are still unanswered. And the institution that holds the data that could answer them has not yet provided a satisfactory explanation for why it continues to hold it in a way that prevents anyone else from looking.